Is Mary. I'm one of the child and teen counselors here at Freedom House. Today we'll be going over effects of domestic violence on children. Like I mentioned previously, if you need a moment to step away, no problem at all. No worries, no judgment. I'm just hoping that this presentation will be helpful in your understanding of the impact of domestic violence on children and also ultimately helping you know how to help your children or any children that you know of that have had this background. So starting off, um, we will be going over this overview. So we're going to be looking at a definition of domestic violence, some of the statistics, the effects of domestic violence on children, which include the roles that children may assume when domestic violence occurs, and then we'll look into how to help our children. At the end, there'll be a little bit of a wrap up where you guys can ask questions, like have a little bit of a Q&A. If any of you have questions before then, though, feel free to just share them or ask before then, and that's totally fine. So, a domestic violence definition. So, we generally characterize it as a pattern of abuse committed with the intent of exerting power and control over the victim. So, as you guys may know, it also includes physical abuse, verbal, emotional, sexual, can be spiritual or religious, as well as economic and financial. This applies to everyone, regardless of race, gender, age, religion. Doesn't really have a barrier there. And I did also want to put a little disclaimer out there at this point that I will do my best to be using gender inclusive language as it does apply to everyone, but there may be times where I'll be using an example or speaking about a hypothetical situation where I'll use he or she language. Statistically, men are more likely to be abusers and women are more likely to be victims. But like I said, this happens to anyone and everyone, regardless of the relationship type or the gender of the abuser or the victim. So, looking at statistics, annually 1 in 15 children are exposed to domestic violence, and 90% of these children are eyewitnesses to this violence. Typically, children from birth to age 3 have the highest rate of victimization. As you can see right there, it's about a little over 1/4 of the population of victims. And then of those victims, about half or a little more so are girls. Bringing it closer to home, we in the year 2020, Freedom House served 336 children through our program here. Of those children, 64% took part in our individual counseling, which is one-on-one, and then 21% were in group counseling. So that was either in a family counseling dynamic or in a group in the school system. And then of the families that were granted shelter, about 49 children overall were in our shelter last year. So, how does domestic violence affect children? So, first of all, I thought it was important to just lay the groundwork that children of all ages are affected in some way by domestic violence. So, will talk about the different stages and ages and how that looks at those stages. But like I said, it affects everyone in some degree. In fact, children are affected just as much as adults, if not more so, as it hinders their development. And then as we're looking at these different slides, as we're looking at the different effects that domestic violence has, it's important to look at the 3 questions of how do the children feel? What are they learning in those situations and experiences? And then how are they acting as a result of that? So first of all, we're going to be looking at effects on infants. So this is typically around birth to 1 year old. So I wanted to just start off by saying that effects of DV start before a child is even born. So it can happen in utero while the mother is still pregnant. During pregnancy, if there's been exposure to domestic violence, there may be higher levels of trauma symptoms in the infant that are caused by stress-induced hormonal changes that are passed from the mother to the infant. And then that can be continued after the child is born, especially if the mother is going through a lot of trauma, a lot of violence, stress going on. The child's going to pick up on that, and that'll just exacerbate the symptoms that the child is already feeling and experiencing. Cognitively, delayed brain development is a huge one. So as you guys probably know, the time from birth to the first couple of years are really crucial in making those neural connections in the brain. So from the minute that the child is born, they're going to be making all kinds of, taking in all kinds of information, learning things constantly, and domestic violence really disrupts that, and it kind of builds on to those patterns and interrupts whatever those the experience that they're having is going to be interrupting the connections that they're making in their brain. So that can also lead to a lack of responsiveness. When it comes to physical symptoms, there might be some that are more well known, like miscarriage, premature birth. There can be birth deformities as a result of injuries in the womb, but afterwards, once a child is born, there may also be broken bones and other injuries. So a lot of times people assume that that's because the child has been deliberately um, abused, and that is also the case, but a lot of times it's simply because the victim may be picking up the child, whether to protect them from the abuser, or it could be in many situations where the victim is picking up the child thinking that they'll be able to protect themselves, thinking that maybe the abuser is going to be deterred from um, hurting them if they see the child in their arms, but oftentimes that's when the child is more likely to be accidentally injured in the process. Um, a lot of illness going on, sleeping and eating disturbances. A huge one emotionally is the insecure, disrupted attachment with caregivers. So, if any of you know about the attachment theory, it's kind of a psychological theory about how relationships are formed between adults, between humans, really. But a big component of that, kind of the foundation, is that depending on what relationship a child has with its primary caregivers or adults in their lives, their parents, will determine how well they'll be able to develop emotionally and psychologically over time. And so this is a really crucial period as well when the child is obviously bonding with the parent, especially the mother. Um, and at this time, they're usually going to be disrupted in that time. So emotionally, they may be more irritable, maybe a lot more excessive or inconsolable crying going on, nervous and jumpy, fearful behavior. Something also I just wanted to note at this point is that a lot of research has shown that depending on the severity of the trauma and the violence that's going on in the home will determine how severe the symptoms and the signs of the trauma, the effect that is having on the child later on. And we'll see that as we go on. They're just kind of keep adding on the different layers as the child's growing up in this environment. So effects on toddlers and preschoolers. So this is around 2 to 5 years old. So kind of some similarities, and you'll see that with all of the different symptoms and effects that I have listed in the different slides. So I won't go into too much detail on some of the repeating ones, but a big one for this time in a child's life is that signs of trauma are not always going to be super noticeable or recognizable. They may just seem to be growing at their normal developmental stage, and that's usually why it's not picked up upon by parents or their caregivers. And on top of that, the child usually isn't at a stage where they can communicate what's going on. They don't have the language ability yet or the emotional span to be able to explain. And so oftentimes it's going to come out in more behavioral or psychosocial disengagement. So what I mean by that is, for example, with cognitive effects. So you'll see a lot of children at this age regressing in their behavior. So if you're potty training, there's going to be issues there. If they have already been potty trained, there might be problems with accidents happening in the bathroom. There might be times where they go backwards in their language ability, so they're not speaking as much. They're not having the vocabulary that they've been learning prior. A lot of different areas there. Physically, similar, like there's going to be broken bones, a lot of illness. But like I mentioned, they can't communicate always what's going on. But a lot of times we see that they have somatic or psychosomatic complaints. And what that means is that the illnesses that they're experiencing are often not caused by physical ailments as much as by psychological or social determinants of that. So maybe they're going to be just saying like, my tummy hurts a lot, my head's hurting. And it's what it's going to look like, but a lot of times it's more than that. It's the stress of what's going on than any kind of real physical thing, like they've eaten something bad or anything like that. Again, you'll see there's that insecure attachment with the caregiver. They may be more withdrawn, having trouble relating to other kids. Um, Again, so they're going to be what adding to the insecure attachment part, they're often going to be clingy, or they may be anxious when they're away from you, or else they may just be ambivalent. So they don't even mind. Like that's usually not that normal for a child to be completely fine with a parent just leaving within reason, but they're often that is often a sign of some kind of insecure attachment going on there. Um, Acting out, increasing aggression, we'll see that a lot as well, where they can't, if they don't have the words to say what's going on, they'll act it out in their physical behavior. And we see a lot of anxiety in that age group as well. So effects on school-age children. So this is between 6 to 12 years. Um, as they're in school, we're going to see more cognitive effects coming out in their academic performance. They're not going to be as consistent. It's often not going to be as high up, or and a lot of this can be attributed to like impaired attention or concentration. They're not paying attention in school. They're very hyper vigilant. Oftentimes, teachers will notice if they are coming from an environment or a home life that has a lot of stress or trauma in the home because of different violent encounters or situations. The child's going to be looking around constantly, wondering, okay, when is the next thing happening? And that's just going to translate into the environment that they go into at school. That's usually one that people will pick up on um, there. Physically, um, frequent illness, similar psychosomatic complaints, eating disorders is a really big one. So this is when they're starting to use food maybe as a coping mechanism. I have a few clients that they rely on food as a comfort thing, more than just the usual like, oh, I like this kind of food. It's more than that. It's often they're relying on food as just the distraction to get them out of that um, space in their head. Sleeping disturbances, the beginning of some risky behaviors, so smoking, drinking, um, some of that going on, even maybe some early sexual behavior at that age. Um, so emotionally, they're also going to be more guarded, withdrawn. They're not going to be able to handle anger very well. Difficulty establishing relationships. So during this time in their life, we see a lot of kids looking to the parent as kind of the role model. So whether it's the abuser or the victim, they're going to be taking on some of the behaviors that they're seeing and modeled for them. And a lot of times that behavior has become normalized as they're growing up in it. They don't even see what the difference is. It's just normal to them. Um, so one thing that research has shown is that kids that grow up within a DV situation, domestic violence going on at home, they're 2 to 4 more likely than two to four times more likely than unexposed children to develop externalizing behaviors, which is more like outward focused behaviors that are aggressive, anger driven, um, maybe just hyperactive, or they also have a lot of internalized behaviors. So that's more inward focused, where it's going to be low self esteem, depression, anxiety. And oftentimes we see the girls having more of those behaviors, the internalized, versus boys who have more of the externalized behaviors. And a lot of times that seems to be related to how society has socialized gender and the ways that women and men and girls and boys are accepted, socially acceptable to be behaving. Um, so often struggling to process and regulate those different emotions. It's a huge one. Effects on adolescents and teens. So similar again, they're going to be in the school system, often going to have poor and consistent academic performance. As they're getting older, they're becoming more independent. A lot of times this is the stage that we see kids dropping out. They're not putting in the effort, understandably, because they have so much stuff going on, or things pile up and they just think, okay, it's not worth it anymore. We're dropping out of school. Similar to the previous stage, they're just going to have impaired attention, concentration, um, physically, kind of similar to the other stages, but this stage also is really marked by the risky behavior. So we saw previously that it's the start. This is more of in that smoking, drinking, substance abuse, practicing unsafe sex, kind of all of that going on. And so something to add to what I had mentioned earlier about, we see it kind of layering on as the child is growing up through these stages. Oftentimes they're going to be having are experiencing less and less ability over time to adapt to what's going on as all of these things keep piling onto them. They're less likely to sustain resilient adaptation over time. And so another thing I wanted to add was just that it's very different when a child is experiencing intermittent stress, like over different periods of time. Maybe a little of something came up, maybe sometimes there was violence versus constant in the home situation. Um, as I mentioned, this is a stage where kids are often very independent. They're trying to figure out their identity, figure out their role in society and their family. There's going to be a lot of confusion there. Often that comes out in how they relate to other people. So they're going to be a little bit more guarded and withdrawn, maybe a lot of shame when it comes to their family, kind of spending time away from the home, trying to get away from that. Um, when it comes to their relationships with others, like I mentioned prior with the other stage, school age children, but just below this, they're already taking on the behaviors that they're seeing modeled. And so a lot of times as they start entering into more serious dating relationships, that's where we see a lot of dating violence come into the picture. And then taking on those abusive patterns that they've seen modeled for them. Like I said, if they've already been feeling a lot of depression, anxiety, experiencing that low self-esteem, that's just going to keep building until it gets to a stage where they are in a place that they can essentially be self-harming, having the access, the time, the independence, and then even suicidal ideation. Um, So moving into roles that children may assume when domestic violence occur. So this is having to do a little bit more with the relation dynamics that are going on in the home. So before we go into the specific subtypes, I thought I'd just give a few general points as we look at that. So one, these roles can be imposed on the child or it may be assumed by the child. They can be played alongside other roles. So a child may have more than one going on at a time, depending on what family members are in the home, depending on who they're with throughout the day. Um, they may come to the surface, especially during abusive incidents. That's when it's going to need to come out and they need to play that role. And usually that's because it's being used as a strategy to cope or survive in that environment. If the role has been imposed on them, so assigned to them by the abuser, that's also going to lead to a lot of feelings of guilt or grief. The first role is called the caretaker. So often this child is the one that acts like a parent to the younger siblings. Sometimes they can even act like the parent to the victim parent, the non-offending parent as well. They're kind of overseeing the routines and the household responsibilities, making sure that the house is being run smoothly, even though there's a lot of conflict, tension, violence going on. They're the ones that are kind of keeping it going. So I have a lot of clients that I've had and met with personally who kind of fit into this role. So they're the ones that are kind of helping to keep the siblings safe during abusive incidents. So a lot of times when I have been in session with some where we'll be talking through like, okay, like when this happened, like where were you? What was going on? And oftentimes they're saying, well, I was in the other room taking care of my younger sister. I was the one putting the TV on, trying to distract them, playing a game with them, kind of doing whatever they can to provide that comfort to the other children in the home, especially when both parents are obviously away or in conflict and fighting and the abuse is going on. So then after those times of abuse, those incidents, often they're the ones to also be relied upon to give that comfort again. So even to the victim, like asking, what do you need? How can I help? What do I need to do? Again, kind of just making sure things are running smoothly, taking care of everyone. So the next one is called the victim's confidant. So this is a little self-explanatory, but essentially this child is the one that is trusted with the non-offending parent's feelings, concerns, and plans. They kind of provide a type of reality check for non-offending parents following abusive incidents. So oftentimes this comes out when there's been an abusive incident and afterwards as the mother or the father, whoever it was that's been abused, is kind of going through the situation and then the abuser comes in and says, oh, it wasn't like that. That didn't happen. That's what you thought happened, but they kind of the parent needs that kind of reality check. And oftentimes they rely upon the child to say, no, I saw what happened. You're right. This was what happened essentially. Yeah, kind of providing that reality check, like I said. On the flip side, then there's the abuser's confidant or assistant. So they're generally treated better by the abuser. They may even be given justifications for abuse against the other parent. So what that means is an example might be the abuser would say, you know, if your mom just made the right food, or she didn't, if she cleaned up the house better, you know, she wouldn't have to go through this. I wouldn't have to teach her a lesson, kind of giving the child or feeding them this information about like, this is why your mom is to blame for what's going on. This child's also usually given the task of reporting on the non-abusive parent's behavior. So I've seen this with some of my clients, especially when they're in a situation where the parents have separated or maybe are divorced and they're living in two different homes, and they're kind of working out a custody situation where one of the children will be told, okay, you need to tell me everything that mom's doing. Is she dating anybody? Is she taking care of you? Did she, I don't know, it could be anything. And they're kind of tasked with this idea of reporting back, and then once they do that, they're rewarded. So given certain privileges, that privilege might even be just a lack of harsh treatment. So maybe the kids they know that if I keep dad or mom happy with this information, then I'm less likely to get hurt because of it. Sometimes this child may be co-opted or forced to assist in abuse of the other parent. So they're made to say demeaning things or physically attack the parent. So kind of adding into that abuse. Again, this is not always the child's choice, but it may be a situation where they feel like they have to do it in order to survive. So if I don't want to get hurt, or if I don't want my younger sibling to get hurt, then I have to take part in the abuse going on. And like I said previously, like this just compounds all those feelings of guilt, shame. Yeah, just really adds to the layers of the dynamics in that situation. The golden child. So that is one where the child essentially tries to prevent violence by actively addressing issues that they wrongly perceive as a trigger for violence. And so what I mean by that is oftentimes they're looking for explanations like, why is this going on in the home? Why is dad doing this to mom? Maybe it's because I didn't do well on my last test. Maybe there's a lot of frustrations there. So if I just did a good job at school, if I, got all the A's that I can, if I can be the best athlete possible, then, maybe there'll be more peace in the home. People will be happy. That's kind of the mindset that's going on in this child's mind. So oftentimes a pattern or a sign of this kind of role is that the child is excelling in school academics and extracurricular activities. They're also the one less likely to argue, rebel, or misbehave. So they're kind of the one that the parents, especially the abuser, can rely upon to not cause trouble or additional trouble in the home. So the scapegoat. So this child is the one that's told or made to believe that they're the cause of family problems or abuse. So kind of the opposite, where the golden child is the one constantly doing everything they can to prevent more tension happening in the home. This child is just told, oh, you are the cause, essentially. They're kind of blamed for what's going on between the parents, and even their behavior is used to justify the violence. So maybe the abuser says, well, if this child didn't keep doing this, and I wouldn't have to, let out my anger in this way, or whatever it is. And a lot of times the correlation is that the scapegoat is the child that has special needs, or maybe isn't related to the abuser. They're just an easy target to blame, essentially. So then we have the referee. This is also kind of self-explanatory, but essentially this child mediates between parents during incidents of conflict or abuse, kind of the middle person, always making the effort to keep the peace in the home. So that's kind of that. Prior to this, we were just talking about the roles that children can assume within a home with domestic violence. And before we transition into ways that we can be helping our children through all of that and after, I did want to stop on this slide and kind of talk about this quote. So this quote is, I'll just read it actually. So a good childhood or a bad childhood doesn't hang on a single moment or even a string of them. You can still make a change and intervene. So this quote comes from a book that I recently read called Childhood Disrupted by Donna Jackson Nakazawa. So the premise of her book is that she's looking at adverse childhood experiences and the ways that they all can contribute to later health problems, especially chronic illnesses and things like that. But a big part of her book is after she looks at all of these adverse childhood experiences, she also considers the ways that we can help mitigate those. So even though there's been a lot of trauma going on, so especially when it comes to kids that are going through domestic violence or have that history in their background. So what are ways that we can be mitigating that? So I just wanted to remind you guys that I think even for me, when I was going through all of those effects, it can get really discouraging. You're just thinking about, oh my gosh, like one thing after the other, all these different stages. How do you get away from that? How do you grow from that? And so I just wanted to put this in here and just let you know that it is possible. We can make changes. We can intervene. There's always time. There's always hope. Um, and I think as parents, especially, you guys have the biggest role in kind of, mitigating that trauma. Kind of, what are ways that we can be modeling healthy behavior, especially after all of that unhealthy behavior that's been going on. Um, so the brain is plastic. I mean, the children are constantly learning new things. And I think what the beauty of that is on the flip side is that they can learn really good things following all of that kind of violence and trauma going on. So, how to help your children. So, I wanted to start off with the four basic S's of attachment. So, seen, safe, soothed, and secure. What each of these mean is, so seen is kind of helping your child feel safe and seen. I mean, by perceiving the things that they, oof, what is happening? Oh my goodness. Wow. So my computer does not like me today. Oh gosh. Not embarrassing at all. It's fine. So seen, helping your child feel seen means perceiving who they are at their deepest level, empathizing with their experience, not only listening to what's going on in their lives and what they're thinking and feeling, but also understanding where they're coming from. Um, Helping them to feel safe seems pretty basic, but I think in times where, it is unpredictable, the stress going on, the trauma, the violence, you don't always know if you feel capable to provide safety for your child. But I want to say that there is a type of safety, emotional safety, where you can be that kind of person who is being the parent who is mitigating all of the things going on. So even though maybe the home life isn't the greatest, like how do we avoid actions and reactions that will add to that? So a big thing that we talk about here at Freedom House is safety planning. So that we do with all of our clients, all of the victims that come through. But how do we start with children at a young age? Um, and that includes emotional safety. So what are things that they can be doing to kind of de-stress, bring them back down from those kind of high tense moments, and that includes soothing them. So just like keeping, as they're encountering these stressful situations, oftentimes are very scary. Just being present with them, letting them know that you're there. Keep your arms open. Always providing what they need, that comfort. And then through those first three, that's how we build security in that relationship and that attachment. And over time, they're going to be developing a sense of well being rooted in the knowledge that they are safe in the world. Even though hard things are going on, scary situations at home, mom or dad is there with me and I can feel secure in that. And so I really love this little cartoon. It's pretty straightforward. I think a lot of times our first reaction to the hard things going on to those we love is to immediately want to fix the problem. Um, Obviously, fixing may not be possible, and a lot of times it's not always the most helpful in the moment when someone's coming to us. And so all we really need to do in that, and the first thing is to just be present with them, to let them know that we're there. So, listening to your child. So, this one also I feel like comes across as pretty basic, but I think this is something that even adults um, maybe need to practice when they're interacting with other adults. So, why wouldn't we do that with our children? So, a lot of times that means being present. So, putting down your phone, looking a child in the eye, whether they're coming to us and telling us how they're feeling, or if we need to go to them and ask them, being ready to hear what they have to say, believing their experience, validating their feelings. They have a lot of feelings going on, um, feelings of hurt, anger, fear, guilt, shame, all of that, and just validating, like, yeah, that is understandable. I can understand and empathize with that feeling because I'm feeling it too. Um, really just making sure that when we're listening, it's not just with our ears, but also with changing how we're acting and how we're responding to them. Not just walking away and being like, oh, thanks for sharing, and then not, not inviting that conversation again. So within that conversation of listening, wanting to acknowledge the injustice. So I think this is really hard for those who have gone through traumatic experiences of domestic violence. The victim themselves may not even be in a place to acknowledge the injustice, but I think that's something that we need to start at a very young age with our kids. um, Being able to say like, yeah, that was wrong what happened to you, like I'm so sorry that you had to experience that, and just really driving home constantly like it is not your fault at all. Like just making sure that that is the baseline of those kind of listening moments where you're hearing what they're saying and how they're feeling, and being able to respond accordingly. um, so then the second piece of that is engaging in safe and open conversations. So you're not just listening, but you're kind of the one also facilitating those conversations as the parent. So you want to acknowledge what's happening around you. And so this one's a big one, that we go over with parents, not denying the violence. So I want to just say up front, like oftentimes it's totally understandable that a victim is not going to want to always, talk about their experience. It's very traumatic. It's not always one that they've been able to process through. Maybe they're not in that space, and that's understandable. But being able to just make sure you're not denying that what's happening, the violence that's happening to your child. Um, so I think that's natural, like I said, to not want to engage in that, but ultimately, um, when parents start thinking like, oh, if I bring up this to my kid, it's just going to compound all of the hard, traumatic things they've already gone through. I don't want to dredge that up. I don't want to have to open that wound again. Well, what we're finding, especially in research, is that part of what makes those adverse experiences so damaging is that we don't talk about them, and instead kids are left to their own devices to make assumptions about what's going on. So a lot of times when we are encouraging parents to talk to their kids about the violence, we just want to remind them that you're not causing more pain that's already there. In fact, you're opening up a space for them to feel safe, to know that they're not alone and that you're walking in that with them as well. You're just taking a burden off their shoulders, and you're sharing it at the very least with them. So kind of like I said, they're going to be making a lot of assumptions when we don't talk about it. And so that's the importance as well of having these conversations, so we can confront the negative lessons that they may be learning. So a lot of the ones that come through, this is, I mean, standard for any child going through domestic violence or has been exposed to it. But a lot of times with my clients, one that I always want to drive home is, like I said, that they are not to blame. So whether or not parents are aware of this, they're often, their children are often internalizing that I am the reason that all of this is happening. Whether they've been told that directly, like you are to blame, you're the reason that all this is going on, or if they are just picking that up on their own, maybe thinking like, oh, if I wasn't here, this wouldn't happen. If I just did better, if I was a better person, if I, whatever it can be, schoolwork, art, music, it can be anything. If I just did better at whatever it is, this wouldn't happen. That's a big lesson that comes out. Another one is often that they're internalizing all of this going on around them, and it becomes normalized over time. So after so many times of seeing dad hit mom, oh, that's normal. It makes sense that when someone gets angry, we can take it out on the people around us, or that's a healthy way, they think, to deal with those feelings, with aggression and a lot of anger going on. It might be that another big one is just that, we don't talk about our feelings. If we talk about it, it would be sign of vulnerability. There's a lot of shame there. And so a big one that we also encourage is just being able to, name the feelings. So kids, especially at a young age, are looking to their parents to provide them with the tools they need to have, a healthy socio-emotional development. And a big part of that is expanding their emotional vocabulary. So a lot of times, part of the stress, like I said, is not just not having these conversations, but not having the words to talk about them. And so, you may not realize it, but being able to say, like talking about your day, like, oh, this part of my day made me feel really upset. And what I mean by that is I was frustrated when this coworker said this to me, or that's just an example. Or it could be, in the home, like, hey, I don't appreciate it when you leave your clothes on the floor after I've just done the laundry. It makes me feel like I'm not appreciated. It makes me feel frustrated and sad, anything like that. Those are just really basic examples, probably not the best ones. But being able to be a parent that talks about your own feelings will open up that space for them to start talking about their feelings. So when they do start talking to you and you have those conversations, you're helping them name, are you feeling sad right now? Are you feeling hurt? Um, why do you feel this way? Like, are you angry? That's understandable. Like, what made you feel angry in this situation? So just normalizing talking about your feelings is a big one. um, so then the next one is opening up space for grounding techniques. So this comes in a lot when whether kids are disclosing information of abuse, that might be the first time they're really talking about it, or it may be that they're just doing whatever they're doing at home, or maybe it's out and about and they're triggered by something. These grounding techniques are just kind of a way to bring them back into the moment, refocus, kind of distract them from the painful memories, the really hard, challenging feelings. Like I said, kind of a way to distract from the triggers. And so one of them that we go over is breathing exercises. So adults do these too. Oftentimes it's kind of a situation where you have to hold your breath for a certain count. You breathe in, you breathe out. But for kids, especially for younger ones, you're going to want to have to be a little bit more creative, because kids aren't always going to be able to understand what you're saying. And so some that I found helpful were, so imagine you're going to be blowing out the candles on a cake. So you're going to take a big breath in and then you're going to blow them all out. One big, try to get all the candles out. It might be, what about blowing bubbles? How is that different? Kind of making it fun for them. So like I saw one once where it was, how would you smell a flower? How would you smell like a bunny? And I guess that one was like you breathe in 3 times and then you let it out. Kind of, you can tailor it to your child or the children in your life, but it's kind of a fun one where they can calm themselves down. We know that our minds, our brains, and our bodies are connected in really crazy ways, and that's one way to just kind of regulate what's going on physiologically, kind of calm down whatever's going on emotionally. So personal affirmations is another good one. So when we're working with younger kids, it might be something really simple, like that they can say to themselves, like, I'm brave, I'm strong, um, I'm smart. And that's just a way of to affirm themselves, but also counteract, like, what are things that maybe they've been told? Like if they're always being put down, or they're always seeing, a parent putting down another parent, they're going to be internalizing a lot of that as well. And then if they're older kids, so maybe teenagers, I've worked with some where we work on, like, what's something that will resonate with them? What's a mantra that they can say to themselves in the really hard moments to just get them over that hill? So I've had some teenagers, they feel like a lot of times they're struggling with self-esteem, and just reminding themselves, like, hey, I not just to build themselves up and to create like an ego boost, but to really just point out realities, like, hey, I've been through a lot and I've overcome that struggle and I'm still working on it, and I'm going to be still, like, I'm going to keep working on it. And just kind of a way to like encourage them, but also again, kind of like setting new patterns and new ways of thinking. So they're not always automatically going for, oh man, I did such a bad job of this. I just failed and I don't know how I'm ever going to, like, just kind of stopping it there and being like, okay, we made a mistake, but how can we look at the ways that we've really grown? How can we look at how we're still growing? Kind of tying in maybe goals or values that they really adhere to. So thinking in categories is another one. This is great for younger kids, kind of getting them out of that. If they're in a hard mind space where they're like really triggered, sometimes we'll just say something like, okay, stop what you're doing. Think of as many animals as you can. Think of as many baseball players as you can. Just kind of those categories. Again, this is good to tailor to your kids' interests. It gets them excited about it. Can be even kind of like a little game. For kids that maybe need more of a movement-based way to connect with their bodies, kind of get them out of that running in place. Might be stretching, doing some kind of yoga. I know people find a lot of good videos on YouTube on there specifically made for kids, dancing. So just taking a moment to do a dance break. Going back to the running in place, if you have a big yard, if you have a neighborhood where you can go out with your kid, letting them run down the sidewalk and come back, racing them, whatever it is to kind of ground them back into their bodies, kind of look at the present moment. yeah, kind of getting them out of that headspace that they're stuck in. So another one is promoting healthy adult slash mentor relationships in your child's life. So this one's a pretty big one. Studies have found that if a child has one stable parent in their life, regardless of the trauma and the domestic violence that's going on, regardless of the other parents' effect on them, this can do so much to build resilience in that child as someone they can look to for support and guidance. Um, uh, that will just do so much to mitigate a lot of the unhealthy parts that are going on at home. And so we often find that if they can have the one parent and then on top of that at least 3 to 4 adults outside of the home, that just continues to promote that kind of resilience that they need to adapt to all the stress and the trauma going on. So that might be a teacher at school, it could be a coach, counselor. So it could be a domestic violence counselor, it could be a mental health counselor, a social worker at the school, maybe outside of the school system, or even just like another relative that they can rely on, whether it's a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt. And then as parents kind of being the ones to facilitate that relationship. So what do you need to do to help your child build that support system for themselves? Like, do you need to take them, if you have the resources, can you take them to see those people? Can you make sure that they make their counseling appointments? Can you make sure that they are just making sure they have the support they need in all those different environments outside of the home as well? Before we end and get to the questions, I did kind of just want to touch on some of Freedom House's services for children and families specifically. So, like I said, I'm one of the children's counselors here, and so we currently offer individual or group for children. And that group can be family, so that can be a parent and a child, or it can be siblings. Those are totally fine. Domestic violence education for teens. So we currently began a pilot program in Marshall County. I think it's going on 2 years now, and that's done really well. We've continued to um, build that program there and have a lot more students come in. I know the other domestic violence counselor for children has seen a lot of good conversations come out of that, where kids can just be very honest about what's going on at home in a safe environment, but also just kind of giving them information, whether that's like what is abuse, something simple like that, or to like how do we identify unhealthy patterns in relationships. So like I said, at that time, they're going to be branching out, becoming more independent, forming their own dating relationships. So kind of helping them in that kind of supporting them in that. We also offer a parenting education course, which is about 10 hours. So this isn't just like a how do you become a parent kind of thing, changing diapers, stuff like that, like feeding schedule. This is more tailored to what happens when I, as a victim, have been in a domestic violence relationship, and how do I help my children cope with the after effects. So kind of topics might include effects of domestic violence on children, the impact that it has on parenting, how do we handle discipline? What about anger and conflict? Kind of navigating all of those areas and more. Um, and yeah, so that is where I'm at. Did anybody have any questions at this point?
You said that you're a children's counselor there. I was just curious as to like what a session with children typically looks like.
Yeah, that's a great question. So sessions at the beginning of our client relationship will look very different. So oftentimes it's me getting to know the kids. I'll be honest, there's a lot of games going on where I'm losing at Candyland. Um, and that's really sad because I'm really trying. But that's a lot of games, just kind of building that rapport. um, when clients come in and they bring their kids and the kids are starting counseling, we do a service plan. And we update that every 3 months. So if the child is under 12, the parent will be the one to determine what those goals are. And that's kind of the framework that I build my sessions around. So a lot of those might be self-esteem, might even be something like opening the child up to having those conversations, because as much as kids can have a good relationship with their parent, they're not always going to want to go immediately to mom or dad and have these hard discussions. It's kind of me talking to them about, what were they feeling in those moments. How do we safety plan if they're still at home with the abuser? So like, how do we plan for like physically, like if something really bad is going to happen, an incident where or mom is becoming violent, what's the safest place in the home? Who can I contact? Do I know how to call 911 if the child's old enough? Can I go to a neighbor's house? That kind of stuff. But then also the emotional side of, okay, dad or mom is constantly putting you down. What are ways can we counteract that? Like how can we be building that resilience now? That's kind of a lot of the conversations that we have.
Are the parents typically present or no?
Typically not. I'm personally fine if a child wants the parent to come in, like whatever they need to feel comfortable. I don't have a problem with that, but probably we try to limit that to maybe like 2 or 3 sessions at the beginning, just because, like I said, over time, some kids aren't going to always want to share certain things in front of their parent, even if it's about the victim. I mean, that relationship's so unique to everybody. They're not going to feel as open or safe. And that's another thing when it comes to confidentiality. We tell the kids, we're not sharing anything outside of this room. Like, this is a very safe space. The only exceptions, obviously, are like if they're going to be hurt or if they're hurting someone else, etc. But a lot of the times, I'm not even sharing certain details with the parent unless it pertains to their safety, to their service plan, and the goals that we've kind of set. And if it
Is there
feels,
an age? Is there a beginning? Is there like what's the youngest child that you'll see?
yeah. So our limit, our minimum is 5 years old. And even then, sometimes it depends on the child and what their language and emotional space, like where they're at there. So they'll come in for a session, we'll assess. So the youngest kid I've ever seen is 4 years old, and she was pretty developed, like cognitively, she can understand. And her mom worked with her a lot on that. And so that was fine. But a lot of times when kids are just not at that stage, um, mentally or cognitively, that's when we kind of keep it to more 5 to 6 years old.
Okay.
Great questions.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have thoughts or questions? Totally fine if not. Well, in that case, I will move on. So just want to say thank you for attending and bearing with me through all of the technological issues going on. Really appreciate that. I do have my info up here. So I'm working at Freedom House. My email's up there. Our phone number is up there. You can always just call, ask for Mary, or just ask for one of the children's counselors. I'm always open to emails. If you guys have any questions or you were thinking like, oh, shoot, I should have asked this. I didn't think about this until now. Totally fine. Just reach out to me. I'm happy to hear from you. Yeah, I think that's all from me today.